After 5 years of saving, countless overtime shifts, and living in a cramped apartment with paper-thin walls, I had finally done it. I purchased my very first home. Not just any home, my dream home. It sat on a quarter-acre lot in Willow Creek Estates, a quiet suburban neighborhood with tree-lined streets and well-maintained properties. The moment I signed those closing papers, a sense of accomplishment washed over me that I had never felt before. The house itself was not particularly large or fancy, but it was mine. 2 bedrooms, a cozy living room with a fireplace, and a kitchen with just enough counter space to pursue my weekend baking hobby. The real selling point, however, was the backyard. It stretched back toward a small wooded area that provided privacy and a sense of being connected to nature despite the suburban setting. I spent the first few weekends meticulously arranging my furniture and hanging photographs that had been stored in boxes for years. Each nail I hammered into the wall felt like I was cementing my place in this community. My neighbors seemed pleasant enough, offering waves and occasional small talk as I worked in the yard or collected my mail. 2 weeks after moving in, I attended my first homeowners association meeting. The gathering took place in the community center, a modest building at the entrance of the neighborhood. About 20 residents sat in folding chairs arranged in neat rows. At the front, a table with 5 people faced the audience, the HOA board members. The meeting was led by a woman named Patricia Winters, who introduced herself as the president of the association. Patricia appeared professional at first glance. Her graying blonde hair was styled in a neat bob, and she wore a blazer despite the casual setting. She ran through the agenda with practiced efficiency, discussing landscaping contracts, the upcoming community garage sale, and reminding everyone about the importance of following community guidelines. Remember, these rules exist to maintain property values and the aesthetic quality of our neighborhood, Patricia explained with a thin smile that did not quite reach her eyes. We are all in this together. I left the meeting feeling relatively optimistic. The rules seemed reasonable enough, standard regulations about trash cans, lawn maintenance, and exterior paint colors. Nothing too restrictive that would make me regret my purchase. One feature of my new home that I particularly appreciated was an outdoor electrical outlet near the back fence. The previous owner had installed it to power garden tools. It was conveniently placed about 15 feet from my patio, allowing me to easily maintain the far reaches of the yard without needing extension cords. About a month after moving in, I noticed something peculiar. While putting away my gardening tools one evening, I touched the weatherproof cover of the outlet and found it unusually warm. This struck me as odd since I had not used it that day. I made a mental note to check the wiring, assuming it might be an electrical issue, but promptly forgot about it amid the chaos of settling into my new home. During a casual barbecue with my next-door neighbors, the Martinez family, I learned more about the neighborhood dynamics. As Ricardo flipped burgers on the grill, his wife Alina leaned toward me and lowered her voice. "So have you had any run-ins with Patricia yet?" she asked. The HOA president. "No, not really. She seemed fine at the meeting," I replied, confused by her tone. Ricardo chuckled without humor. "Just wait. Everyone calls her Karen behind her back. She lives in the blue house 3 doors down from you, right next to the wooded area. She thinks being HOA president makes her the neighborhood queen. She cited us for having the wrong shade of beige on our mailbox last year," Alina added, rolling her eyes. "We had used the exact color from the approved palette, but she insisted it was too dark." This conversation gave me pause, but I brushed it off as typical neighborhood gossip. Surely she could not be that bad. As I settled into my routine, I discovered another feature of my home that would prove crucial later on. During a particularly heavy rainfall, I ventured into the basement to check for leaks and noticed a specialized pump system installed in a small alcove. Curious, I contacted the previous owner who explained it was a sewage ejector pump. "Your house sits at one of the lowest points in the neighborhood," he explained over the phone. "That system pumps wastewater up to the main sewer line. Without it, heavy rains could cause backflow issues in your basement. It is connected to your main electrical panel but has a dedicated circuit and outlet to ensure it has consistent power. Very important system. Do not let it fail." I thanked him for the information, making a mental note to have it serviced regularly. Little did I know that this overlooked detail would become the centerpiece of a neighborhood conflict I never sought but would ultimately win. The first indication that something was amiss came when I opened my electric bill in April. I stared at the total, blinking in confusion. It was nearly double what I had paid the previous month, despite no real change in my habits. I lived alone, worked regular hours, and was conscientious about turning off lights and appliances when not in use. "This cannot be right," I muttered to myself as I reviewed my usage history. The graph showed a clear upward trend over the past 6 weeks. Something was drawing substantial power, but what? I checked all my appliances, confirming none were malfunctioning or running constantly. The mystery deepened when I received the May bill, which was higher still. Now genuinely concerned, I began a methodical investigation of my electricity usage. I purchased a simple usage monitor and began tracking which appliances consumed the most power. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. My refrigerator, air conditioning, and water heater all operated within normal parameters. It was not until a particularly busy week at work, when I left home early and returned after dark for 5 consecutive days, that a pattern emerged. During this period, my power usage spiked between 10:00 a.m. and 2:00 p.m., hours when I was never home. This realization sent a chill down my spine. Someone was using my electricity when I was away. My thoughts immediately went to the outdoor outlet I had noticed months earlier, the one that occasionally felt warm to the touch despite my not using it. Could someone be plugging into my power supply? To confirm my suspicions, I invested in a small outdoor security camera. It was disguised as a bird feeder, battery-powered, and equipped with motion detection. I positioned it with a clear view of the outlet and waited. 2 days later, I reviewed the footage with a mixture of shock and anger. There she was, Patricia Winters, HOA president and self-appointed neighborhood guardian, casually walking onto my property at 10:15 a.m. with an extension cord in hand. Without hesitation, she plugged it into my outlet and ran the cord over the fence to her yard. The camera captured her smug expression as she disappeared from view, only to return 4 hours later to disconnect. The footage showed this was not a one-time occurrence. Over the next week, Patricia, or Karen, as the neighbors called her, used my electricity nearly every day to power various devices: phone chargers, garden tools, and what appeared to be a small water fountain. No wonder my bill had skyrocketed. Before confronting her, I decided to review the HOA bylaws. As expected, there was a clear section on property boundaries and unauthorized use of utilities. No homeowner shall access, utilize, or impede upon the private property, structures, or utilities of another homeowner without express written permission. Armed with this information and video evidence, I approached Patricia one evening as she retrieved her mail. I kept my tone polite but firm. "Good evening, Patricia. I need to speak with you about something important," I began. She turned with a practiced smile. Yes. Is there an issue with your property? I noticed your hedges are getting quite tall. Actually, it is about my outdoor electrical outlet, I replied, showing her a still image from my security camera. I have noticed my electric bill increasing dramatically, and now I understand why. You have been using my electricity without permission. Her smile never faltered, but her eyes hardened. Oh, that old thing. I have been living here for 15 years, dear. That outlet has always been available for community use. The previous owner never minded. That is not true, and you know it, I countered, maintaining my composure. It is on my property and connected to my electric meter. I would appreciate it if you would stop immediately. Patricia laughed dismissively. It is just a little electricity. Do you really want to make a fuss over something so trivial? That is not how we build community here in Willow Creek. It is not about the amount, I explained. It is about respect for property boundaries. Please do not use my outlet again. She gave me a cold stare before walking away with a wave of her hand. I will take it under advisement, she called over her shoulder, clearly having no intention of complying. Frustrated but determined, I purchased a lockable weatherproof cover for the outlet the very next day. It was a simple device, a clear plastic box that's secured with a small padlock, allowing access only with a key. I installed it that evening, feeling satisfied that I had solved the problem. My satisfaction was short-lived. The following afternoon, I returned from work to find the lockbox damaged, the hinges broken, and the cover hanging uselessly. The outlet itself was exposed, and the warm socket confirmed it had been used recently. This was no anger about electricity. It was a deliberate act of property damage and a clear message. Patricia Winters believed she was above the rules. The broken outlet cover represented a line crossed. This was now about principle, not pennies on an electric bill. I documented the damage with photographs, noting the date and time. Then I sat at my dining room table and composed a formal letter to Patricia. The letter was polite but unambiguous. I detailed the unauthorized use of my electricity, cited the specific HOA bylaw she had violated, and included an estimate of the additional electricity costs based on my previous bills. I requested she cease all use of my outlet immediately and reimburse me for the damaged lockbox and excess electricity charges. I concluded by stating that further incidents would necessitate formal action through HOA channels or legal means if necessary. I printed the letter on nice stationery, placed it in an envelope, and hand-delivered it to her doorstep the next morning before work. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing the letter would be waiting for her, a formal record of her trespasses that could not be dismissed with a wave of her hand. Her response came swiftly but not in the form I expected. 3 days after delivering my letter, I found an official HOA violation notice taped to my front door. According to the citation, my mailbox was not in compliance with neighborhood standards, as it was supposedly half an inch taller than regulation height. The fine was $50, due within 30 days. I measured my mailbox immediately. It was exactly the height specified in the HOA guidelines. This was clearly retaliation, but I decided to document it rather than confront Patricia directly. I photographed the mailbox with a measuring tape clearly showing it met requirements. 2 days later, another violation notice appeared, this time for excessive lawn height. Supposedly my grass was a 1/4 inch above the 4-inch maximum. The fine was $75. The day after that, I received a notice about unapproved landscaping elements, referring to a small garden gnome my mother had given me as a housewarming gift. Another $50 fine. Within 2 weeks, I had accumulated over $300 in bogus HOA fines, each more ridiculous than the last. My hedge was too dense. My hose was improperly stored. My garbage can had been visible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection. None of these violations were valid, but all came directly from Patricia in her role as HOA president. The situation took an even more disturbing turn when I reviewed my security footage from that week. Not only was Patricia continuing to use my electrical outlet despite the letter and broken lockbox, but she was now entering my property at different times of day, taking photographs of my house and yard, presumably searching for more violations to fabricate. This was trespassing, plain and simple. The casual way she strode onto my property suggested she had been doing this long before I installed the camera. The thought of her invading my space while I was away filled me with both anger and unease. I needed perspective, so I invited Elena Martinez over for coffee one Saturday morning. As we sat on my patio, I shared my growing conflict with Patricia. "I am not surprised," Elena said, shaking her head. "You are hardly the first person she has targeted." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Patricia has a pattern. Anyone who stands up to her suddenly finds themselves buried in violation notices. 2 years ago, the Thompsons questioned her decision to use HOA funds for new decorative street lamps. Within a month, they had so many fines they decided to sell and move rather than fight." Elena went on to describe other neighbors who had faced similar treatment. The Jacksons, an elderly couple who opposed Patricia's proposed increase in HOA fees. The Singhs, who requested accommodation for religious holiday decorations. All had faced Patricia's vindictive response through her position of power. How does she stay president if everyone dislikes her? I wondered aloud. Fear and apathy, Elena explained. Most meetings, only her supporters show up to vote. The rest of us got tired of fighting, and she schedules important votes during holiday periods when many families are traveling. That evening, I began researching in earnest. First, I reviewed state laws regarding electricity theft. I discovered it was indeed a crime, classified as a form of utility theft. I also looked into local ordinances about property trespassing and HOA regulations. Armed with this knowledge, I decided on a multi-pronged approach. First, I would document everything meticulously. Every instance of trespassing, every fraudulent violation, every kilowatt of stolen electricity. Second, I would gather support from other neighbors who had experienced Patricia's tyranny. And third, I would build an irrefutable case that could be presented to the full HOA board or, if necessary, local authorities. I purchased a notebook and labeled it Patricia/HOA documentation. Inside, I created sections for different types of incidents, complete with dates, times, and reference numbers for digital evidence stored on my computer. This would be my armor against her attacks, and eventually my sword to end her reign of petty tyranny. As I closed the notebook that night, I felt a shift within myself. I was no longer simply a victim of neighborhood politics. I had become something more dangerous to someone like Patricia, an organized opponent with documentation and determination. The outlet that had started this conflict was just the beginning. Now it was about justice, not just for me, but for everyone who had suffered under her leadership. To effectively counter Patricia, I needed to understand her. Not just her current behavior, but her history in the neighborhood and what motivated her actions. I began my investigation by speaking with longtime residents, carefully framing my questions as casual conversation rather than an inquisition. Mr. Jenkins, a retired teacher who had lived in Willow Creek for over 2 decades, was particularly informative. We chatted as he walked his golden retriever past my house one morning. Patricia, oh, she moved here right after her divorce about 15 years ago, he explained. Seemed nice enough at first, kept to herself. Then she joined the HOA board as secretary and, well, she found her calling, you could say. According to Mr. Jenkins, Patricia had engineered a takeover of the HOA board about 12 years ago. The previous president, a well-liked retiree named Charles, had health issues and stepped down. Patricia positioned herself as the only candidate with enough experience to take over. Once she had the presidency, she rewrote some of the bylaws, Mr. Jenkins continued, created this complex voting system that practically guaranteed she would stay in power. Most of us did not even understand the changes until it was too late. Over the next few weeks, I spoke with other neighbors, building a comprehensive picture of Patricia's reign. A pattern emerged of selective enforcement of rules, favoritism toward board members and friends, and swift retribution against anyone who challenged her authority. The Andersons told me about being fined repeatedly for their son's basketball hoop, while a board member's identical hoop was never cited. The Wilsons described how their request to install solar panels was denied without explanation, despite being explicitly permitted in the HOA guidelines. Most disturbing was the story from Mrs. Gonzalez, an elderly widow who had been reduced to tears at an HOA meeting when Patricia publicly humiliated her over a minor landscaping issue. What I could not figure out was why Patricia was so fixated on using my electrical outlet. The cost savings to her could not be that significant, certainly not worth the risk of being caught stealing. There had to be more to the story. The missing piece fell into place during a conversation with David Kim, who lived directly across from Patricia. We were discussing neighborhood issues when he mentioned Patricia's financial troubles. It started about 2 years ago, David explained. Her son had some kind of legal trouble, DUI, I think. She hired an expensive lawyer, then there were fines, court costs. You know how it adds up. How do you know about her financial situation? I asked, surprised by this personal detail. David looked embarrassed. My wife works at Lakeside Credit Union. She cannot share specifics, of course, but she mentioned that Patricia has been struggling. Apparently, she had to take out a second mortgage. Then her air conditioning unit failed last summer, complete replacement, very expensive. This new information cast Patricia's electricity theft in a different light. It was not just petty theft or entitlement. It was desperation. She was cutting corners wherever she could, even if it meant stealing from neighbors. But the true revelation came during a heavy rainstorm the following week. I was checking my basement for any signs of water intrusion when I noticed the sewage ejector pump cycling on and off frequently. The rain was overwhelming the system, forcing it to work harder than usual. As I watched the pump operate, a thought suddenly struck me. I rushed upstairs to examine the electrical panel in my garage. There, clearly labeled, was a dedicated circuit for the sewage pump. I traced the wiring as best I could and made a startling discovery. The outdoor outlet that Patricia had been using was connected to the same circuit as the sewage pump. This was potentially dangerous. If she drew too much power while plugged into that outlet during a storm, she could overload the circuit and cause the pump to fail. And if the pump failed during heavy rain, I immediately called the electrician, who had inspected the house before I purchased it. I described the setup and my concerns. "Oh yeah, that is definitely not ideal," he confirmed. "That pump needs dedicated power. If someone is pulling additional current from that circuit during heavy usage, you could trip the breaker. And if that pump stops working during a big storm." "What happens?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Sewage backup," he said simply. "Into your basement, it would not be pretty." As I hung up the phone, I stared out the window at the rain lashing against the glass. Patricia had not just been stealing my electricity. She had been unknowingly jeopardizing the system that kept raw sewage from backing up into my home. The irony was not lost on me. Her entitlement and theft could literally create a flow of consequences back in her direction. I sat at my kitchen table, watching the rain and contemplating this new information. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a smile spread across my face. Perhaps there was a way to resolve this situation that would provide the perfect justice, letting Patricia's actions create their own natural consequences. I opened my documentation notebook and began a new section titled Strategic Response. It was time to move from defense to offense, not out of vengeance, but to restore proper boundaries and respect in our neighborhood, and perhaps teach Patricia a lesson she would never forget. The following morning, I called Scott Reynolds, the electrician who had previously inspected my home. I explained the situation in detail, including Patricia's unauthorized use of the outlet and my discovery about its connection to the sewage pump circuit. Scott agreed to come by that afternoon to assess the situation properly. When Scott arrived, he conducted a thorough examination of my electrical system. He traced the wiring, checked the circuit breaker, and inspected the sewage pump in the basement. "Well, your suspicions were correct," Scott confirmed, making notes on his clipboard. "That outdoor outlet is indeed on the same circuit as your sewage ejector pump. It is not an ideal setup, but it passed code when it was installed because the pump does not draw that much power under normal circumstances." "What happens if someone plugs in a high-wattage device while the pump needs to run at full capacity?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Scott frowned. "During normal weather, probably nothing. The circuit should handle both. But during heavy rain, when the pump needs to cycle frequently, that could be a problem. If someone plugged in, say, an electric lawn mower or power tools during a storm, it could overload the circuit and trip the breaker. And if the breaker trips during heavy rain, then your pump stops working," Scott said grimly. "Wastewater has nowhere to go except back up into your basement. We are talking potential thousands in damage, not to mention the health hazards." I nodded slowly, processing this information. "Is there any way to separate these systems? Put the outdoor outlet on a different circuit?" "Absolutely," Scott replied. "But it would require rewiring, possibly breaking through some walls, looking at several $1,000s of work." I thanked Scott for his assessment and paid his consultation fee. As he packed up his tools, he paused. "You know, there is another option. I could install a power monitoring system on that circuit. It would not prevent overloads, but it would alert you if the power draw was approaching critical levels, and it would document exactly when and how much electricity was being used." This suggestion aligned perfectly with my developing plan. I scheduled Scott to return the next day to install the monitoring system. The following week was devoted to preparation. First, I purchased and installed additional security cameras, higher resolution models with night vision capabilities. I positioned them strategically to capture multiple angles of my backyard, the outlet in question, and the area where Patricia crossed onto my property. Next, I researched local attorneys specializing in property disputes and HOA issues. After several phone consultations, I found Margaret Chen, an attorney who had successfully handled similar cases. We scheduled a meeting for the following Monday. When I met with Margaret, I brought my documentation notebook and digital evidence. "You have been thorough," Margaret remarked as she reviewed my materials. "That will serve you well whether this ends in negotiation or litigation." "What exactly are my rights here?" I asked. "Multiple laws are being violated," Margaret explained. "Trespassing, theft of utilities, property damage, and harassment through fraudulent HOA violations. Additionally, the fact that her actions could potentially cause significant property damage by interfering with your sewage system elevates the seriousness." "So what do you recommend?" Margaret tapped her pen thoughtfully. "Given what you have heard about this individual, direct confrontation is unlikely to resolve the situation. In fact, it could escalate her retaliatory behavior." "I agree," I said, thinking of the mounting HOA violations. "I suggest we prepare two documents," Margaret continued. "First, a formal cease and desist letter regarding the trespassing and electricity theft. This establishes legal notice. Second, a comprehensive package documenting all violations that can be presented to the full HOA board, bypassing Ms. Winters entirely. And if those do not work, then we proceed to small claims court for the financial damages and potentially seek an injunction to prevent further harassment." Margaret met my eyes directly. "But based on my experience, people like your HOA president often back down when confronted with irrefutable evidence and the prospect of public exposure." I left Margaret's office with a clear legal strategy and a sense of confidence. She would prepare the necessary documents while I continued gathering evidence. The final piece of my plan came together when I recalled something Alina had mentioned during our conversation: Patricia's habit of scheduling important HOA meetings when many residents were traveling. Two could play at that game. I planned a vacation for the following weekend, which weather forecasts predicted would bring substantial rainfall. I would make it obvious I was leaving, packing my car in full view, stopping mail delivery, setting timers for my lights. But in reality, I would stay with Alina and Ricardo, monitoring my property remotely through the newly installed camera system and power monitors. In my garage, I set up what amounted to a command center, a laptop connected to the security cameras and power monitoring system. I configured alerts to be sent to my phone if the power draw on the pump circuit exceeded 80% capacity or if motion was detected near the outlet. I tested the system repeatedly to ensure everything worked perfectly. The final touch was subtle but essential. I removed the damaged lockbox from the outlet but did not replace it. To Patricia, this would appear as if I had given up trying to secure the outlet. In reality, I was providing temptation, a clear opportunity for her to continue her pattern of theft, especially when she believed I was away. As the week progressed and the forecast confirmed heavy rain for the weekend, I felt a curious calm settle over me. This was no longer just about electricity or property boundaries. It had become a test of character and consequences. Patricia had chosen to abuse her power and ignore the rights of others. Now she would experience the natural outcome of those choices. The night before my departure, I reviewed everything one final time: cameras operational, power monitors calibrated, legal documents prepared, weather forecast showing 3 inches of rain expected over the weekend. All systems were ready. I packed an overnight bag with genuine vacation essentials, not for show, but because I would indeed be staying elsewhere. As I zipped the bag closed, I glanced out my window toward Patricia's house. The lights were on, and I could see her silhouette moving behind the curtains, unaware that her actions were about to come full circle in a way she never anticipated. Friday morning arrived with ominous dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The weather forecast had proven accurate. A major storm system was moving in, predicted to drop significant rainfall throughout the weekend. Perfect conditions for my plan to unfold naturally. I performed my departure with theatrical precision. At 9:00 a.m., I loaded luggage into my car, making sure to make several trips back and forth from the house. I adjusted window blinds, brought in the welcome mat, and put a hold on my mail delivery, all the typical signs of someone leaving for a trip. As a final touch, I spoke loudly on my phone in the driveway about looking forward to my weekend getaway while locking the front door. Instead of actually leaving town, I drove to Alina and Ricardo's house just 3 streets over. They had graciously offered their guest room for the weekend, understanding the importance of what I was trying to accomplish. From their home, I could monitor my property via the security system while maintaining the appearance of being away. "Are you sure this is going to work?" Alina asked as she helped me set up my laptop on their dining room table. "It depends on 2 things," I replied, connecting to my home security network. "First, whether Patricia takes the bait and uses the outlet during the storm. Second, whether the rain is heavy enough to tax the sewage pump system." Ricardo brought me a cup of coffee, and if both those things happen, then nature takes its course, I said simply. The circuit overloads, the breaker trips, and the pump stops working. Physics and electricity do the rest. By noon, the rain had started, a gentle patter that gradually intensified as the afternoon progressed. I monitored the security feeds, watching water begin to pool in low spots around the neighborhood. The sewage pump in my basement would already be cycling more frequently, though still well within its capacity. At 2:17 p.m., my phone chimed with an alert. Motion detected at the rear of my property. I quickly switched to that camera feed and watched as Patricia appeared, wearing a rain jacket with the hood pulled up. She looked around furtively before approaching my outdoor outlet. "Right on schedule," I murmured. Patricia was pulling a large covered object on a wheeled cart. As she removed the tarp, I recognized a professional-grade electric pressure washer, a high-wattage device that would draw significant power. She plugged it into my outlet, ran the cord over to her yard, and disappeared from view. Moments later, I could see water spray as she began cleaning her patio furniture. The power monitoring system immediately registered the increased draw on the circuit. Under normal conditions, this might not have been an issue. But with the sewage pump already working harder due to the rainfall, the system was under strain. I checked the weather radar. The heaviest bands of rain were still approaching. This was just the beginning. I settled in to watch the situation unfold, documenting everything with screenshots and recording the video feeds. By 4:30 p.m., the rain had intensified dramatically. Water coursed down gutters and pooled in streets. The power monitor showed the sewage pump cycling almost continuously now, struggling to keep up with the influx. Patricia's pressure washer continued to draw substantial electricity, pushing the circuit ever closer to its limit. At 5:42 p.m. it happened. The power monitor showed a sudden spike as both the pump and pressure washer tried to operate simultaneously. Then, just as suddenly, the reading dropped to 0. The circuit breaker had tripped. "It is time," I said to Alina and Ricardo. "I need to return home now." The drive back to my house took only minutes, but I drove carefully through the flooded streets. As I pulled into my driveway, I could already see water beginning to seep from beneath my garage door, the first sign that the sewage system was backing up. I grabbed my raincoat and the waterproof case containing all my documentation. As I made my way around to the backyard, I could hear the sound of splashing and frustrated cursing coming from the direction of the outlet. The scene that greeted me was exactly as I had anticipated. Patricia stood in ankle-deep water that was no longer just rain but had the unmistakable odor of sewage. Her expensive pressure washer was partially submerged, and she was frantically trying to disconnect it from my outlet. Water continued to rise around her feet as the sewage pump remained inoperative. Having some electrical issues, Karen, I called out calmly. Patricia spun around, her eyes widening in shock. You are supposed to be on vacation, she sputtered. Clearly, I am not, I replied, holding up my phone which was recording our interaction. But you are trespassing on my property and stealing my electricity. Again. I was just, she began, but her words trailed off as she noticed the rising water around her ankles and the distinctive smell. What is happening here? What is happening, I explained calmly, is that the outlet you have been stealing electricity from powers the sewage ejector pump for my house. By running your pressure washer during a heavy rainstorm, you overloaded the circuit and tripped the breaker. Now the pump is not working and sewage is backing up into my basement and apparently my yard. The color drained from Patricia's face as the implications sank in. I did not know, she whispered. Of course you did not know, I agreed, because you never asked permission. You never considered that your actions might have consequences. You just took what you wanted, as always. Patricia looked down at her expensive shoes, now ruined by the rising sewage water. I can explain, she began. Save it for the emergency HOA meeting I will be calling tomorrow, I interrupted. For now, I suggest you disconnect your equipment and leave my property immediately. I need to reset the circuit breaker and minimize the damage you have caused. As Patricia gathered her pressure washer, I added, Oh, and Patricia, I have documentation of every time you have used my electricity, every fraudulent HOA violation you filed against me, and every instance of you trespassing on my property. I also have the name of every neighbor you have bullied over the years, all of which will be presented tomorrow. She paused, the weight of her actions finally seeming to register. Without another word, she wheeled her pressure washer away, leaving muddy tracks across my lawn as she retreated to her house. I reset the circuit breaker, allowing the sewage pump to resume op. Aeration. The damage had been done, though water and sewage covered portions of my basement floor and had seeped into the yard. It would require professional cleaning, but that was a problem for tomorrow. For now, I had everything I needed, irrefutable evidence of Patricia's actions and their direct consequences. The perfect storm had indeed arrived, in more ways than one. The community center was packed the following evening, a stark contrast to the typically sparse attendance at HOA meetings. Word had spread quickly about the incident, and residents were curious to see how the situation would unfold. I arrived early, setting up my laptop and connecting it to the projector that was usually used for budget presentations. The emergency meeting had been called by the HOA vice president, a mild-mannered man named Harold who had always seemed intimidated by Patricia. Tonight, however, Harold appeared newly emboldened as he called the meeting to order. We are here to address serious allegations concerning HOA leadership and governance, Harold began, his voice steady. As this concerns the current president, I will be chairing this meeting. Ms. Winters will have an opportunity to respond after the allegations have been presented. Patricia sat in the front row, her usual confident demeanor notably diminished. She wore a rigid smile that did not reach her eyes, her fingers nervously tapping on her purse. The room full of neighbors, many of whom had suffered under her reign, watched with undisguised interest. Harold gestured toward me. We will begin with the formal complaint and evidence presented by our neighbor, who has documented a pattern of concerning behavior. I stood and connected my laptop to the projector. Thank you for coming tonight, I began. What I am about to show you represents not just my personal experience, but conduct that affects our entire community. The lights dimmed as I launched my presentation. First came the utility bills showing the unusual power consumption patterns, followed by time-stamped security footage showing Patricia repeatedly using my outdoor outlet without permission. Murmurs spread through the audience. As you can see, this occurred multiple times over several months, I explained, advancing to the next slide. When confronted about it, Ms. Winters dismissed my concerns and continued the behavior. Next came documentation of the damaged lockbox, clear evidence of property destruction. I methodically worked through each piece of evidence. The fraudulent HOA violations filed against me, footage of Patricia entering my property to take photos, and testimonials I had collected from other residents who had experienced similar treatment. But the situation escalated significantly yesterday, I continued, bringing up the most damning footage. During the rainstorm, while she believed I was away, Ms. Winters connected a high-wattage pressure washer to my outlet, the same outlet that powers the sewage ejector pump for my home. The room grew quiet as I showed the footage of the circuit overloading, followed by the sewage backup and my confrontation with Patricia. The video clearly captured her standing ankle-deep in the rising water, her face registering shock as she realized what had happened. The damage to my basement required professional cleanup services costing over $2,000, I concluded. But the greater cost has been to our community, the atmosphere of fear, selective enforcement of rules, and abuse of power that has pervaded our neighborhood for years. When I finished, Harold turned to Patricia. Would you like to respond to these allegations? Patricia stood slowly, her composure visibly shaken. I admit I used the outlet occasionally, she began, her voice tight. But I had no idea about the sewage pump connection. As for the violations, I was simply enforcing our standards, which is my responsibility as president. Standards that you selectively enforce, Alina called out from the back of the room. You cited me for wind chimes but said nothing when your friend Susan installed the exact same ones. And you denied my request for a satellite dish, even though federal law specifically allows it, added Mr. Jenkins. Suddenly, the dam broke. One by one, neighbors stood to share their own experiences. Arbitrary rejections of improvement requests, excessive fines, intimidation tactics, all carried out under Patricia's leadership. Mrs. Gonzalez, the elderly widow, rose shakily to her feet. You humiliated me at a meeting last year when my son could not mow my lawn for 2 weeks because he was in the hospital. You know what he was in for, donating a kidney to his cousin, but you still fined me and made me cry in front of everyone. Patricia appeared smaller with each testimony, her defenses crumbling under the weight of collective experience. When the last neighbor finished speaking, Harold called for a vote of no confidence in the cur. NT HOA President. A provision in the bylaws that Patricia herself had apparently never anticipated being used against her. The vote was nearly unanimous. Patricia Winters was removed from the HOA board, effective immediately. Additionally, Harold announced, we need to address the property damage and theft of utilities. Does anyone object to requiring Ms. Winters to cover the cleanup costs through her homeowner's insurance? No objections were raised. Patricia stared straight ahead, her face flushed with humiliation. After the meeting, Several neighbors approached me with handshakes and thanks. Mr. Jenkins clapped me on the shoulder. "That was long overdue," he said with genuine relief in his voice. "Maybe now we can have a community again instead of a dictatorship." The following week brought remarkable changes to Willow Creek Estates. Patricia's insurance company contacted me about covering the damage to my basement. The check arrived promptly, along with a formal letter of apology that I suspected her insurance had required her to write. More importantly, the HOA held a special election to fill the vacant board positions. Alina was elected president, with a diverse group of neighbors forming the new board. Their first action was to review and simplify the community guidelines, focusing on necessary standards rather than arbitrary rules. As spring turned to summer, I noticed other changes as well. Neighbors chatted more freely across driveways and fences. Children played outside without parents anxiously checking for violations. Community events saw record attendance. The atmosphere of surveillance and judgment had been replaced by genuine neighborliness. Patricia kept to herself for several months. When she finally began to emerge, she was noticeably different, quieter, less intrusive. I occasionally saw her walking her small dog in the early mornings, her eyes downcast when she passed my house. One evening in late summer, I was installing a new, professionally wired outdoor outlet. This one properly separated from the sewage pump circuit, when a shadow fell across my work area. "Excuse me," came a hesitant voice. I looked up to see Patricia standing at a respectful distance from my property line. "I wanted to say I am sorry for everything." I stood wiping my hands on a rag. "I appreciate that, Patricia." "I never meant for things to go so far," she continued. "The power of being in charge, it just changed me somehow." I nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting her explanation. We all make choices about how we treat others. "Yes," she agreed quietly, "I am learning that again." She gestured toward my new outlet installation. "That looks much safer." "It is," I confirmed. "Properly wired separate circuit and—" I held up a new lockable cover, secure. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Understandable." She turned to leave, then paused. "The neighborhood looks nice these days. Alina is doing a good job." "She is," I agreed. "It turns out leadership does not have to mean control." Patricia nodded thoughtfully before continuing her walk home. I watched her go, reflecting on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. What had begun with an unauthorized electrical connection had exposed the connections between all of us. How power, both electrical and social, flows through a community, and how its misuse can lead to unexpected consequences. I finished installing the new outlet, complete with a weather-resistant cover and clear private property labeling. It was a small thing, but it represented something important: boundaries, respect, and the proper flow of power throughout our neighborhood. Some lessons, it seems, require a perfect storm to truly sink in.